Well, welcome to the latest in our videos from the very Reverend William McMillan Library here in Dunmurry. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I was taking a service at Warrenpoint. And just before I went into the church to take the service, I noticed an old gravestone I'd not seen before. It was carved on slate and the lettering was very, very clear. And it dated from 1888. And it was the grave of the former Precentor at Warrenpoint, a man called Thomas Donnan, who had died aged 60 in 1888. Now, the Precentor, of course, was the person who was responsible for leading the singing of the psalms. He would have had a tuning fork. He would tap the tuning fork to get the note. And he would lead the congregation in singing the psalms, often line by line. So I thought that was an interesting thing to see, and I wrote a little bit about it on my blog. And in the description to this video, I will put a link so you can read about it if you're interested. But when I discovered this grave, I had a look in my friend Elaine Crozier's book, Short History of the Warrenpoint Congregation Across the Narrow Water, to see what she said about music in the church. And she says a couple of things. She says, in 1841, the church committee made the decision that they should employ a teacher to teach the choir. And then she says, in 1842, the committee instructed that the new collection of psalms compiled by the remonstrant ministry be put into the hands of the families belonging to the church. So this made me think about hymn books and about music and about singing in our churches, because our churches were amongst the first Presbyterians to adopt the use of singing hymns. Before about 1800, all our churches would have simply sang the psalms. They would have had a psalter book, and they would have sang the psalms only, unaccompanied. After about 1800, there is a move towards music being played in church, and also there is the beginnings of the creation of separate hymn books within our denomination. We were pioneers in that regard. And what I'd like to look at today are some of the hymn books that we have here in the William McMillan Library, because we have a wonderful collection of non-subscribing Presbyterian hymn books. As I mentioned, some of the first hymn books to be produced amongst Presbyterians in Ireland, and we have a very good collection of them here. So the story of Irish non-subscribing Presbyterian hymn books begins with this one. This is an example of the hymn book introduced into First Church Belfast in 1801. It's called Psalms, Hymns and Spiritual Songs, selected for the first congregation of Presbyterians in Belfast, printed by William McGee in the year 1801. Now, this is interesting on a number of levels. One is that in that year, Edward Bunting offered to provide an organ for First Church, but they declined his offer. And yet a few years later, in 1806, Edward Bunting became the organist at the second congregation, and they had an organ installed in that year in the second congregation, an organ built by a Mr. Hull, who was an organ builder in Belfast. So that was a very historic moment. But you would have thought that the first church to have a hymn book would have been the first one to install an organ. But no, this hymn book was the first one, and it was produced for First Church. So they also had a choir. They will have had a precentor too, but there will have been a choir. We know there was a choir, in fact, which would have helped with the singing of the hymns. Now, the second hymn book appeared quite close to Warrenpoint, and that's one of the things that made me think about music and hymnody in Warrenpoint, because the second hymn book appeared in Newry in 1811. And this is a copy. We have a number of copies here in Dunmurry. Many of them belong to the Warnock family. But this was entitled A Collection of Psalms, Hymns and Spiritual Songs proper for Christian worship, selected and arranged for the use of congregations and families. And this was produced in Newry, edited by the Rev A.G. Malcolm, printed by R. Moffat of Sugar Island in 1811. So quite a substantial hymn book, quite an innovative production, and made for the congregation of Newry. So this is the second non-subscribing Presbyterian hymn book. So a collection not only of psalms, but of hymns and spiritual songs, and not only for worship, but also for private devotion. In the preface it says, as the work is intended for general use and must be expected to fall into the hands of persons who unavoidably differ from one another in their opinions on religious subjects, all expressions which appeared likely to give offence to any sincere Christian have been studiously avoided. So here we can see the non-subscribing tendency to be irenic, to avoid confrontation or controversy. And what's interesting in this hymn book, if we look at the index of first lines in the back of the book, they list in italics alongside the first line the names of the hymn writers. So we can see here the names such as Doddridge, Watts, Merrick, Barbauld, Wesley, Enfield, and also Malcolm's own hymn. So hymns being drawn from the Protestant dissenting tradition and also from the traditions of rational dissent, Kippis, Brown, and different collections as well. So an eclectic collection of hymns, which places this Newry collection by A.G. Malcolm well within the tradition of dissent, religious dissent in the British Isles in the early 19th century. Now, for our next hymn book, we have to return to Belfast, and this is it. It's a hymn book produced in 1818. This is the third hymn book, and this was edited by W.D.H. McMillan, who was the minister of the Second Congregation. So this was the hymn book which from 1818 would have been used in accompaniment with the organ that was established in Second Belfast. And this is entitled A Selection of Psalms and Hymns for the Use of the Presbytery of Antrim and the Congregation of Strand Street, Dublin. Belfast, printed by Francis D. Finlay, 1 Corn Market, 1818. So a very strong non-subscribing production. And I think we can see also a hymn book being produced that moves away from being for the use mainly of one congregation. And again, we see similar sentiments expressed that make sure the users of this hymn book will not have to face any doctrines they disapprove of. So in the preface, it says here, some doctrines are so offensive to the societies for whose use this compilation is principally intended that they are carefully avoided. As to others, the same scrupulosity is not observed, for with respect to them, there may exist a diversity of sentiment. This selection may therefore be thought defective, but it will not disgust by a pertinacious obtrusion of doctrine. So some years pass until we see the next hymn book, which becomes fairly widely distributed amongst non-subscribing Presbyterian churches. And this is it. Psalms, Paraphrases and Hymns for Christian Worship, printed in Belfast by H. Clark and Company and sold at the Bible Christian Office, Rosemary Street, in 1841. The Bible Christian, of course, was the magazine, the journal of the non-subscribing Presbyterians. And this is, for the first time, really a denominational hymn book, if you like, the one that was acquired in Warrenpoint in about 1842. And again, it isn't just psalms, it's paraphrases and hymns, and would have required some considerable leadership in the music. And so in most cases, I think the worship would have been led, if not by a precentor, but also by a choir. So this is 1841, a nicely bound copy of this hymn book. This one belonged to James Warnock, again of Newry. But this hymn book went into a number of editions throughout the 19th century. So this is the first edition of 1841. And this is the second edition of 1856. And the title has changed slightly. It now says Hymns for Christian Worship, edited by members of the non-subscribing Presbyterian Church of Ireland, Belfast, printed by Alex Main, High Street, 1856. And it's interesting to see the title, the non-subscribing Presbyterian Church of Ireland, because really that name does not formally become the name of the denomination until 1910. But there it is, already giving this sense of denominational identity, an expanded second edition of that hymn book of 1841. And so on to the third edition. The third edition is published in the year 1875, and the title is well established as Hymns for Christian Worship, edited by members of the non-subscribing Presbyterian Church of Ireland. And I've got two copies here just to show that the same book could look very different, because very often the people who bought these hymn books, they would have got them bound themselves. So the bindings can vary on every one of these different editions. And this one belonged to James Andrews, this one to G.G. Henderson, and you can see that this one has been particularly nicely bound. So this series of hymn books really reaches its peak in about 1886. So here's the next edition. This is a hymn book which is much more recognizable to us in more recent decades. It has a similar sort of format and shape. Hymns for Christian Worship, new edition, published with the authority of the Association of Irish Non-Subscribing Presbyterians. So a reference there to the official name of the body that governed the non-subscribing churches, because it was before the denomination had been formally created. Published in Belfast and printed by Marcus Ward and Company Limited, 1886. So if we flick through the book, we can see the names of many hymn writers which are still familiar to us today. I've just opened it more or less at random. There's William Gaskell. There is Isaac Watts. There's Richard Baxter. There's W.H. Drummond, who was minister in Belfast and Dublin in the 19th century. There's J.H. Newman. There's John Page Hobbs. So it's a hymn book that's more like what we're used to today. And this one is published in 1886. And then it's followed by another edition, a second version of this new edition in 1890. Essentially the same, but it shows how popular that hymn book had proved and how it needed a new edition. Now, this whole procession of hymns for Christian worship, hymn books created by and for Irish non-subscribers, comes to an end just before the end of the 19th century with the publication of a supplement to hymns for Christian worship. And this is published in 1899 and interestingly is now printed in Glasgow. And it says in the preface, the present compilation has been prepared as a supplement to hymns for Christian worship. Many excellent tunes have been published from time to time to special hymns and to others in the less usual measures. The compilers have selected the best of such hymns for this supplement. They've also added a number in the ordinary meters by celebrated English and American authors. And it speaks of hymns by Lord Tennyson and Miss Winkworth, that's Catherine Winkworth's hymns, which were translated from German. So we have in this book an additional over 180 hymns to add to the previous book. And there the hymns for Christian worship story ends. We can look at some time at the hymn books that are used in our churches in the 20th century, and there's a whole story to them that goes right on up to the present day. But we're very much blessed here in the Very Reverend William McMillan Library to have such a collection of hymn books. I don't think there will be many libraries that have such a full collection of these types of hymn books, because libraries didn't usually collect them. They were in churches or they were owned by people and by families, and they didn't get preserved quite as well as you would often wish. But we're fortunate to have them, and they provide a very interesting and informative illustration of the development of singing in our worship in our denomination.